There's a mistake. Moonlight, you guys won Best Picture.
You like me right now. You like me.
Ever since I was a little kid, I wanted this.
Mom, I just want an Oscar.
I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of the Ultimate Oscar Showdown, the third episode of the series that I've just launched a couple weeks ago. You guys have been showing a lot of support, lots of comments and likes. I really do appreciate that. That's the reason why I create these videos, to create an awesome film community. So please do that, keep that up. I'd love to hear your comments below. But without further ado, if you're new to the series, because most of you are, essentially how this will work is I tier rank from S tier all the way to D tier the Best Picture winners of a given decade. We've already done the 2000s and the 2010s, doing the 90s. We're going to continue this series of ranking Best Picture winners all the way into the 40s, and then we're going to talk about acting categories. So I'm going to rank the Best Actor winners and the Best Actress winners in all the decades from the 2010s to the 70s. Best Picture, we're going to go a little bit further back. We're going to go all the way into the 40s, but actors we're going to keep within the past 50 years. But jumping into things, the 1990 winner, Dances with Wolves, is our first movie, and I've actually covered this movie on a full video of my Forgotten Oscar Films series where I talked about it in depth. So if you want to hear real in-depth thoughts about that video, about my thoughts on that movie, you can check it out there. And essentially this is the movie that's known for being the movie that beat out Goodfellas. I think that's its sort of larger reputation, and I think that's its biggest legacy, just because Kevin Costner's directing career is a little bit strange, because he does Dance with Wolves and then has a huge bomb with The Postman, his next film, and then does Open Range, which not a lot of people have seen, and then he sort of disappears. He's mounting a comeback, so it's going to be interesting to see. But it is this weird period where he essentially gambles on himself, wins Best Director, wins Best Picture. It's this big thing. He's a big movie star, really, of this period, late 80s, early 90s, continues that up until, I guess, sort of 97 with Postman, and then he doesn't recover for almost 20 years, 15 years later. I mean, the period between Postman and I'd say Draft Day, Man of Steel. I mean, you have the Graceland movie and a couple other odd, weird ones, even something like Open Range, just not the dominant star power that he had. And he really created that star power for himself because of this film here, because he directed it, because he started it, and then created that path and that formula that we're going to see throughout this video and throughout the decade of winners like Mel Gibson, like Clint Eastwood. Kevin Costner really sort of started this, at least for the 90s, epic historical film where an actor turns to director, stars himself, kind of a bit of a vanity project, but maybe a successful one at that. And you can point to other director actors, guys like maybe even Orson Welles with Citizen Kane, and you can even go to like Warren Beatty with Reds, or Robert Redford for Ordinary People. But Redford didn't star in Ordinary People, didn't feel like a vanity project in that way. Reds with Warren Beatty definitely did, but his movies never won Best Picture. That was his big chance in Reds, but it didn't win Best Picture. This was the first one where it was not only a Best Director win, but a Best Picture win, and a solidifier that this can work. And like I said, next year, or 2 years from now, Unforgiven, and then Braveheart, we see this sort of path continue and continue to be rewarded throughout the 90s, and it starts here. But speaking of the movie itself, aside from that historical context, I've personally always felt a little bit more mixed towards the film. I think it's sort of white man comes into a Native American community and learns about them and becomes one of them, is maybe a story that we wouldn't necessarily tell today, just because of its cultural maybe insensitivities and how we see the white savior story now in a modern lens. So it does, I think, date itself in that regard, and it's a 3-hour plus movie, so it's really slow and demands a lot of your attention, which I wasn't totally able to 100% fully get on board for that. That being said, the movie is undeniably beautiful. I think for a lot of people, the West is always like Nevada or California, it's the desert. But in this film, when we have, shooting in the Wyoming or the Dakotas, that sort of mountainous part of the American West, is a rare setting that we don't often see. And I think Costner photographs that really beautifully, and it's a setting that we often, even still today, don't see too often. So when we get all these great landscapes, Costner really has sort of an understanding and appreciation of sort of the beauty and the poetic nature of the American West, and particularly this region. So I think it's undeniably beautiful, even though I don't totally engage emotionally with the story and feel like it's a little bit dated. So because of those reasons, we're going to put this one in the C tier. Then 1992, the winner is Silence of the Lambs, and I think it's one of the best picture winners of all time, and one of those movies where I don't begrudge people when they say it's maybe the greatest movie of all time. I think it's that good. It's in that conversation, and it reminds me of a movie like Casablanca or Wizard of Oz, where every department is batting 1,000. Every department is performing at their highest capabilities and come to the story with the best that they've got, and that sort of all coalesces. Everything sort of went right on this movie and coalesces into an intense crime genre type movie, horror movie with also great performances and weightier themes as well. You know, whether it be Anthony Hopkins and his iconic character of Hannibal Lecter, which is still, you know, franchised today in many regards, or Jodie Foster, who I think is the perfect, intelligent but still petite and small, vulnerable protagonist, where she's not stupid but she can still be physically vulnerable, that kind of balance there. And then Demi, who totally understands the trappings of the genre but is also able to elevate it. You know, I think it's often forgotten that Silence of the Lambs really elevated the thriller genre. The thriller genre before this was Hitchcock, and then Brian De Palma sort of riffing on Hitchcock. It was a certain type of movie that Hitchcock defined. Jonathan Demme here redefined the genre, and now if you release Silence of the Lambs, I think in 2023, it could be seen as a movie that's inspired by the true crime genre of the 2010s, or the true crime podcaster craze and the true crime documentary craze, even though Silence of the Lambs, of course, came out in 91 and really changed that genre. And it's just a film where everything is clear. Demme totally understands the emotional stakes of the film and plays with that expectations of emotional satisfaction or of tension. There's a continued pace of the film, which is just, there's no fat on any scene. It's persistent, it's clear, and it's a movie that I think everyone enjoys. Well, you can also sort of read a little bit more deeper into the feminist allegories of the film, or Hannibal Lecter maybe representing something larger on that scale, or you just appreciate it as a great serial killer movie. There's a lot going on towards it, and I think it's an absolutely perfectly crafted film. So without a doubt in my mind, I think it's in the S tier. 1992's winner is Unforgiven, and that's also a movie we've covered actually 4 or 5 years ago now. Back in 2018, I did a series called Old on Old, where I was watching old classic movies for the first time, and Unforgiven was in that bunch. And I had some troubles with it the first time around, didn't really understand the motives, thought it was a little bit slow. This time it worked a lot more for me, although I'm not necessarily a huge fan of it. I wouldn't say this is a classic Western in the top 10 Westerns of all time. I still have some issues with the film, particularly some of the motives that I initially felt, even some of the slow pace of it. The first hour really takes its time, and I actually like the Clint stuff a lot now, but the Gene Hackman stuff I feel like is a little bit too long and a little bit unnecessary. You sort of need that for that final confrontation, but I felt that maybe the reward of that final confrontation wasn't worth spending an hour and 15 minutes really with Gene Hackman and his character and him just being kind of a prick, and I don't necessarily understand the empathy or the emotion I'm supposed to have for that character, so that struggles with it for me. But, you know, the difference between my 2018 watch and my 2023 rewatch was my understanding of Clint, and I think this movie, for better or for worse, is entirely indebted to the idea that it's trying to say. That this is Clint, you know, the guy who starred in movies like Outlaw Josie Wales and High Plains Drifters, movies that are intensely violent and almost glorious of the West and the killings that are portrayed in that film, and then now seeing the slower, more brutal interpretation of the West, this sort of very much revisionist Western that Clint really helped define with Unforgiven, I think, in a solidified way, and it helps in a way that he's the guy that was starring in those movies is now looking back on it. That meta element really worked the second time, now that I've seen more of his films, more of Clint's films. So I have a complicated relationship with it because I really like the Clint stuff. I thought the sequences, which are brilliant, whether it be the scene between Clint and the prostitute that got her face cut up, or even just the death of the first cowboy where he's just bleeding out in the dry desert sand. It was really impactful and really sort of emphasizing of that point that Clint was trying to make. That being said, I still think that the point of the film is maybe more powerful than its execution, and I think this genre has sort of evolved, but because of my general appreciation of a lot of the stuff with Clint, and because of its historical importance, you know, it's still a movie that I liked, especially this time around, so I'm going to put this one in the B tier. Schindler's List, the 1993 winner, is an undeniable film. Its camera work from Spielberg, its blocking is some of the best, maybe the best of his career. The performances are all well realized. Yeah, it's a movie that I've always had a complicated relationship with. I think that some of its sequences, whether it be the shower scene or even just the I could have saved one more scene, feel a little bit insensitive or manipulative in a way that I don't totally appreciate just on a personal level. So it's a movie I've always had complicated feelings with, because it's undeniably technically well made, and yet the tone and the approach to the story feels a little bit gross. It feels a little bit dishonest to the actual tragedy of the event by making it sort of this traditional hero's journey, and then making these tense moments as to whether or not water is going to come out of the shower or if it's going to be gas, and sort of playing on some of those maybe traditional Hollywood elements that work well when it's maybe, will this guy fall off a cliff, and work a little bit less when we're talking about a real historical event. Just the way in terms of those sequences were staged didn't really work for me, and yet, you know, the genius of the film, just that simplicity of having the red coat being that representation of how the world turned a blind eye to the Holocaust as it was happening. So it's a complicated movie for me. It's undeniable in its technical mastery, and I do love Spielberg, but it's never one that I ever rewatch, and even when I do rewatch, and I rewatch it for this episode, it just came off once again a little bit sort of slick and slimy, and a little bit too Hollywood for the actual realities of the event. So I'm going to put this one in the C tier for its technical ability alone. 94 was the Forrest Gump year, and one of the best Oscar years of all time, just because it's a fun Oscar year to debate. The other nominees, whether it be Shawshank Redemption, Pulp Fiction, or even Four Weddings and a Funeral and Quiz Show, are really sort of, I think, 5 great movies, but for a lot of people it's those top 3. Forrest Gump, Shawshank, or Pulp Fiction. And a lot of people think, you know, Pulp Fiction or Shawshank maybe could have won, so they have a little, think of Forrest Gump as kind of a punching bag, and it has become a punching bag in many regards because of its sort of simplistic view of America in the 20th century. That being said, I think it's a super fun movie and an iconic movie. I think a lot of people sort of knock on the movie because it beat out 2 other more popular movies, and I probably would have chosen one of those 2 over Forrest Gump. That being said, I still really like Forrest Gump. You know, it's similar to a movie like The King's Speech that beat out the Social Network, where The Social Network is a clear classic, better movie than The King's Speech in my opinion, but King's Speech is still good. The difference is Forrest Gump is actually still culturally relevant. Not only did this make a lot of money at the box office, but it also is, you know, Halloween costume still. It's still iconic, and I think you have to appreciate the film as this sort of boomer trip through the 20th century of America. And because you have such an interesting protagonist played really sweetly and funny by Tom Hanks, and you have this really rapid pace where we have to go through all of the important events of America in the 20th century through Forrest's perspective, it allows it to have, I think, a very modern pace in how it tells its story. It's a pretty long movie, but it always keeps our attention, and in terms of its events and its speed of how it's even just edited and paced as a story. And I do like the sort of conceit, simplistic as it may be, of Forrest being the representation of all things good sort of within America, but then Jenny being the counterbalance of some of the more darker sides that you don't necessarily want to talk about of America's history from, you know, the 50s up until the 80s, 90s. And as a Gen Z myself, I do think that you can almost read it as a satirical take on the boomers in the 20th century of America, where even this really dumb, dim-witted guy can sort of fall ass backwards into success. It's almost an unintentional satirical element to the film that can be read in that way, and is funny in doing so. But even regardless of that, I do think it's a well-paced, interesting movie, an interesting sort of take on some of these historical events. I think Tom Hanks is genius as Forrest Gump, very funny, understands the sweetness that also comes with Forrest. So funny movie, sweet movie, entertaining movie as well, but also I think uniquely, maybe unknowingly satirical, but still satirical maybe in that regards. You can take that away from it regardless. So I actually really like Forrest Gump, and it's a sweet movie, and I still like it. So regardless of what the internet says, I'm gonna have to put this one in the A tier. Braveheart 1995 was a surprise winner because everyone thought it was going to be Apollo 13, but instead it was rewarding another big actor turned director, Mel Gibson, winning director, winning picture of this real star vehicle for Mel. And I think a lot of people's reputation of the film is a little bit soured because of some public comments that Mel Gibson has made, although I don't think it's on the level of, you know, movie we'll talk about later, like American Beauty or certain movies that are absolutely sort of canceled, for lack of a better word. And I think Braveheart still lives on because of that, regardless of its historical inaccuracies that you can take on it, or even Mel's personal behavior. The movie itself, which is ultimately what we judge on the show, the movie, not always historical content, but what it is today, the movie is terrific, particularly that first half, where it's just so well paced and so clearly explained in these small sort of silhouettes and sequences. The relationship at the center of the film, at least for that first half, between William Wallace and Imran, the childhood lover, we'll call her, is both heartbreaking and sweet and romantic, and so quickly. Mel is a great director because he's so quick at being able to develop that relationship, doing small tricks within the film, and then also even when we get to the freedom battle sequence, entertaining and rousing and a totally invigorating battle sequence. And Mel, like I mentioned, sort of understands the balance of the brutality, but also the love, sort of the yin and the yang of the film, where, and like I mentioned, those certain tricks that he employs, like shooting around in 27, 28 frames per second, so a little bit lower than, so a little bit higher than normal, which when you play that has almost a slow motion kind of effect to it. Or whether it be in the action sequences, he actually removes certain frames and then duplicates other ones, so you get almost like this freeze frame stop ability, but just for half a second, to really make some of those punches and stabs of the spears impactful. I mean, just think of the sequence where you have the spears and all the horses falling. It's impressionistic, it's artistic, and really impactful ultimately to that end goal. The second half of the movie doesn't work as well for me because it sort of, William Wallace doesn't evolve as much of the character as I liked. But that being said, I still like the sort of Robert the Bruce traitor, will he, won't he kind of a element too. And then of course, in line with a lot of Mel's films, the sacrificial lamb, the Jesus Savior type of William Wallace dying on a cross is emphasized and hit home, but still I think is consistent thematically with its overall career. It's a mythical take on William Wallace's story nonetheless, but a movie that I absolutely enjoy and I think is a brilliant way of communicating sort of an overall underdog story through a historical lens. While it may not be historically accurate to a T, it still is emotionally honest and true, and a true epic. So it's a movie I enjoyed quite a bit. So I'm actually going to put this one in the A tier as well. The English Patient, the 1996 winner, I think is maybe the most forgotten film from the Best Picture winners. I covered it on an episode of Forgotten Oscar Films a couple of years ago because it's a movie that won 9 Oscars, and yet very few people really go back and rewatch and appreciate it. I mean, I would think it's, even if you think of the other Best Picture winners like Forrest Gump or American Beauty, they may not be as well liked as they were when they won Best Picture, but they're still well remembered. They're still part of the culture, whereas English Patient has really been forgotten, even maybe forgotten at the time. And it's a complicated and a movie that I struggle with because you can hear my thoughts more in depth in that episode. But essentially, there's 2 storylines within the film: the Juliette Binoche storyline and the Kristen Scott Thomas storyline. And I think the Kristen Scott Thomas storyline, with that tortured romance with Ralph Fiennes and that connection, that sort of historical melodrama epic feel, is so beautiful and well realized and reminiscent of some of the stuff that Saul Zaentz did in his career. But then the stuff with Juliette Binoche, I feel, really drags down the film. It spent a little bit too much time with it. Even their sort of relationship with Naveen Andrews, which is really well fleshed out in the book, isn't so in the film, so it feels a little bit rushed and underdeveloped. So it's a movie that has these 2 halves, one that's really good and one that's not. So I have some more of a complicated relationship to the movie because of that. Because that sort of complexities within the film, that I like one part but I don't like the other part. It's kind of a 50-50 mixed reaction for me, so I'm going to put that one in the C tier. Titanic is the next movie, the 1997 winner, and like Lord of the Rings last year, this is a historic Oscar movie just because it won the most Oscars ever, tied for Lord of the Rings and Ben-Hur with 11, and has the most nominations ever with 14. It's one of the biggest movies of all time, and its reputation, I think, early on was an easy punching bag as well, because it was the big movie of the year, made all this money, won Best Director, won Best Picture. James Cameron was the king of the world. So it was easy, I think, to sort of critically knock it down a few pegs, and that's populist, and that's only a movie for teenage girls, it's not as sophisticated as a Good Will Hunting. But I think in the more recent years, there's been a little bit of a reclamation of, no, it's actually a really terrific movie. It's not just populist entertainment, it's actually the best version of that, and it's a well-regarded piece of art now, I think, nowadays. And I think I'm more so on that regard. And I think that's because of its recontextualization of it truly being a melodrama. And I think it's a great melodrama. So when people criticize things like the stereotypical characters and the tropiness of the script and even the dialogue, I think that's totally excused away in the sense that if you appreciate this film as a melodrama, which has these heightened stakes. So you have this first half, which is this big melodramatic romance, but then the second half is a melodramatic disaster movie. And you know, in some of these films like Unforgiven or English Patient, they're a tale of two halves, or they're two different movies at the same time, and you either like one or you don't like the other, or you have some complicated feelings. Titanic is a movie like that as well, where there's two clear halves in Titanic. And guess what? Both of them are great. Both movies, the romance and the disaster part, are both terrific. Of course, you have undeniable chemistry between Leo and Kate as Jack and Rose that propels the film so much, where you really do believe their love and appreciation for each other. But then, of course, the beautiful cinematography that is emphasized, that in the production design, the glamour of it all. Even still, in 20 years later, it feels a movie that feels glamorous and epic still in this era. So beautiful romance, beautiful technical, well-realized appreciation from James Cameron. One of his best films, and that's definitely saying something. So I'm going to put Titanic in the A tier. Then in 98, the winner was Shakespeare in Love, and this was the infamous Miramax versus DreamWorks battle, the infamous Harvey Weinstein versus Steven Spielberg, the small indie New York studio Miramax versus the big king of Hollywood in DreamWorks and Steven Spielberg. And I think its reputation as a film, Shakespeare in Love, is intimately tied to that, unfortunately, but truthfully. And I think its reputation is, in a way, almost somewhat deserved. I think people think of it as this sort of sentimental, sweet, gawkish kind of a film versus the sort of major, epic, serious film for Saving Private Ryan. And even still today, Saving Private Ryan is a masterpiece. It's a movie that probably should have won. It's a movie that's still watched today, that made a true impact. Versus Shakespeare in Love didn't really go anywhere. It was a product of FYC campaigning real heavily, but also a lot of DVD screeners that were sent to voters. That its reputation is a movie that won Best Picture, that almost bought it versus necessarily deserved it. And I do think the reputation is deserving of the type of film it is. It's very sweet, it's very saccharine, but it's burdened with its overpowered score and simplistic narrative. And I think the fact that the two protagonists like each other so early on, it really kills any sort of sense of narrative propulsion throughout the film, because you already get those stakes and dramatic tension. It's sort of immediately resolved within 30 minutes in the film. So there is some struggle with that regard. There's a huge, I think maybe if some people really love Shakespeare, they'll really like this movie. But for me, it was just sort of overly infectious and joyous without sort of explaining to me why it was such a big thing. It was just like these people hearing these lines and then falling in love. And I'm sort of like, wait, why am I supposed to understand this? What's the emotional work and emotional understanding that you're supposed to do to help me as a viewer relate and connect to these characters? It just sort of assumes that. I have always had issues with movies that do that anyways, so I'm actually going to put this one in the D category. And then the final movie, the 1999 winner, American Beauty. 1999, one of the best years of cinema of all time. And this was a super interesting rewatch for me, because I saw American Beauty when I was, 16, 17, something like that. And I really liked it the first time I saw it. And then hadn't seen it in a long time until this recent rewatch. And in the meantime, I'd seen so many pieces from Ringer or Time sort of criticizing the movie, and I think its modern day reputation is that. It is a movie that critics don't necessarily appreciate the way they once did, and even people online are a little bit more mixed on it. So going into the film, I was sort of expecting to notice something that would really sour on this time. But as a matter of fact, it didn't happen. I still really enjoyed it. I think it's a really well-made film. And now there is this sort of big stain on it with the fact of Kevin Spacey being the main character, and even just the fact that he has this storyline where he's falling in love with a 16-year-old girl, his daughter's friend, and then of course Kevin Spacey in real life had a lot of these sexual assault allegations with minors, so there is this sort of weird correlation there. But I think a lot of people forget that it's not just a Kevin Spacey film, that's actually an ensemble with a lot of great, interesting, different characters. What I appreciate about the movie is its obvious but potent critique of 90s American social values and the urges and repression that were caused because of that. Whether it be sexuality or appearance or just a general malaise, I think that it really captured this sort of 90s American thoughts that a lot of people are having. And you may think that it's a little bit lame to center a story about being unhappy when you're living in a big house and being a white suburban family in the 90s, and that there are other sort of stories to tell about, which may be fair, but for the most part you have to, I think, treat the movie as it is. You shouldn't criticize the movie for what it should be, but instead for what it is and how it's about that. And I think American Beauty is a classic example of that, because yes, maybe you wouldn't tell that story today, maybe it's dated because of that, but it's also in many ways a time capsule in the feelings of 90s America in this experience. But I also think it does go greater than that. It's not just a 90s capture of societal values at the time. Certain themes like appearance or sexuality, I think, still appeal to a modern day audience, and they still do sort of transcend some of the trappings of the 90s. So it's no wonder to me that every teenager kind of likes this film, or even someone like myself still likes it, because there's so much in the film that's easy to relate to, depending on what stage of your life you're in, whether it be having that midlife crisis, or weird sexual feelings, or repressed sexual feelings, or personal identity, or sexuality, or being self-conscious about your body, or having unclear sort of devolving relationships with your spouse, or devolving relationship with your kid that you once used to have a connection with. There's a lot going on within the film of sort of the family unit that, regardless of the 90s era, still relates to, I think, the modern day family unit that people can still connect onto. And I think beautifully directed by Sam Mendes. There's a sense of confidence in which very few amount of coverage in the scenes. There's slow, long pushing in takes, I think, adds to the sort of slow, methodical malaise and contemplation that the film ultimately has. He totally understands the tone, and when you watch the movie, you fall back into that spell. If you haven't seen the movie a lot and you just think sort of negatively upon it, I think you'd be surprised, even through a rewatch, just how compelling the movie is in that. To me, it always felt novelistic, like a movie based on a novel, even though it wasn't. So I don't know how people thought about the movie at the time, whether or not they fell into that sort of spell and then woke up recently and thought back negatively towards it. All I know is I can treat it as a movie as it is, and I think it's an incredibly successful movie for expressing its themes, which I think are in part a great time capsule of 90s America, pre-9/11 America, but also I think larger themes about appearance, sexuality, personal opinion, and suburban malaise, we'll call it. So all that, I think it's still a really successful film. I'm going to put that one still in the A tier. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know your thoughts on all the Best Picture winners. Rank them for me. If you think I had any controversial opinions, maybe a couple in there. I'd love to hear that. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss next week's video, where we'll be talking about the 80s winners. Amadeus, Rain Man, Chariots of Fire. Lots of really interesting ones to talk about. So that's going to be a fun one too. But that's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.